Vivienne Cole had built her entire adult life on being underestimated and then proving everyone wrong. She had done it as a scholarship student at a school full of trust fund children who never let her forget she didn't belong. She had done it as a first-year associate at Whitlock Graves, one of Chicago's most storied law firms, where she outworked, outlasted, and outargued men twice her seniority, until the partners had no choice but to notice her. Now, at 34, she was one of the youngest senior associates in the firm's 112-year history, 3 months from a partnership vote that would change her life. There was only one part of her story she had never quite learned to be proud of, and that was her husband. Marcus Doyle was, by every metric, the people at Whitlock Graves cared about, unremarkable. He didn't golf, he didn't invest, he didn't have opinions about single malt scotch or the right kind of watch. He worked long, quiet hours doing something in the court system that Vivienne had stopped fully explaining years ago, because every time she tried, she watched her colleagues' eyes glaze over, and the shorthand she eventually settled on, "He works in the courts." Administrative stuff was easier than the truth, which was that she genuinely wasn't sure how to make his job sound impressive. At a cocktail party, she loved him. That part had never been in question. He was steady in a way nothing else in her life was. He remembered how she took her coffee before she'd finished asking for it. He read constitutional history for fun, the way other men read spy novels, and he had a way of listening to her complain about a brutal week that made her feel, for 10 minutes, like the case actually mattered less than she thought it did. But love, she had come to understand with the kind of quiet shame she never said aloud, was not the same thing as pride. And lately, walking into a room full of managing partners and their spouses, orthopedic surgeons, hedge fund founders, a woman who sat on 3 corporate boards, she felt something close to the opposite of pride. When she introduced Marcus, the Whitlock Graves Winter Gala was the single most important night on the firm's calendar. It was where the partnership committee quietly took the measure of the associates being considered for promotion, not just their billable hours, but their polish, their spouses, their ability to move through a room of old money without embarrassing anyone. Vivienne had known this for months. She had rehearsed, in her head, exactly how she would carry herself. She had not rehearsed what to do about Marcus. "You don't have to come," she told him 3 days before, folding a blouse into her suitcase with more precision than the task required. "I know it's not really your scene." Marcus looked up from the book he was reading, something with a cracked leather spine, a biography of a jurist she didn't recognize, and studied her for a moment longer than she was comfortable with. "I want to come," he said simply. "It's a big night for you." She should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the private calculation she hated herself for making. What will they think? The Grand Ellington Ballroom, rented for the evening, was the kind of room designed to make ordinary people feel small. 3-story ceilings, a chandelier the size of a small car, dripping crystal light across gold-leafed walls, a string quartet station beneath an arch of white orchids. Vivienne arrived in a midnight blue gown that had cost more than she wanted to admit. Her hair swept into a low chignon, every inch of her constructed for exactly this room. Marcus wore the same navy suit he'd worn to 3 weddings and a funeral, slightly out of step with the tailored, glossy black tuxedos filling the space around him, and she felt the gap between them the moment they walked through the door. "Vivienne, there she is." Preston Hale, the firm's most senior litigation partner, materialized with a glass of champagne and the practiced warmth of a man who had decided months ago that she was worth cultivating. His eyes moved briefly, expertly, to Marcus. "And this must be my husband, Marcus," Vivienne said, and heard herself add, unprompted, "He works in the court system." "Ah." Preston's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes did, a small, almost imperceptible recalibration, the look of a man revising a number downward. "Clerk, is it? Bailiff?" "Something like that," Marcus said pleasantly, and did not elaborate, and Vivienne felt a flush of something she couldn't name climb up her neck. The evening unspooled the way these evenings always did. A slow current of introductions, of small talk calibrated to the net worth of whoever was speaking, of Vivienne performing a version of herself that was sharper and glossier than the woman who cried at her desk after a bad ruling. Marcus drifted at the edges of it, a drink in his hand he barely touched, watching the room with the same quiet attentiveness he brought to everything. And twice Vivienne caught herself scanning the crowd to see who had noticed him standing alone. It was at dinner, seated at a round table of 10 with 3 other senior associates and their partners, that it started in earnest. So, Marcus, this was Gretchen Voss, married to a corporate partner, a woman who had perfected the art of asking questions that were really weapons. What exactly do you do in the courts? Viv's always so vague about it. I work with case administration, Marcus said. Mostly procedural. Procedural, Gretchen repeated, savoring the word like it confirmed something. So, paperwork, essentially. Essentially, Marcus agreed, unbothered, and took a sip of water. Laughter moved around the table, light and cutting in the way only laughter among the very comfortable can be. Vivienne felt her jaw tighten and said nothing, and hated herself for saying nothing. It's honest work, said Bradford Ellis, a fourth-year associate who had never once let Vivienne forget he'd gone to Yale. Somebody got to file the paper. Keeps the lights on for people like us to actually argue the cases. Bradford, Vivienne said, a warning in her voice that came out thinner than she meant it to. I'm not being unkind, Bradford said, holding up his hands, grinning. I have enormous respect for support staff. Genuinely. The system doesn't run without you, Marcus. More laughter. Marcus's expression didn't shift at all, which somehow made it worse, as if he'd absorbed 100 rooms like this one and built a wall none of them could touch. Vivienne stared at her plate, the salmon she hadn't eaten a bite of, and thought, this is the price. This is what it costs to sit at this table. It was Gretchen who pushed it further. An hour and 2 glasses of wine later, when the conversation circled back, as conversations at that table always did, to the thing everyone actually cared about. Viv, is it true you're up for partner this cycle? Gretchen's smile was bright and sharp. How thrilling. Though I have to ask, and I mean this with love, does it ever feel strange? Building a career like this, moving in rooms like this, and going home too, she gestured, vaguely, generously, toward Marcus. Paperwork? The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when everyone is pretending not to be listening. Vivienne opened her mouth. She didn't know, even as she did it, what she was going to say. Some defense, some deflection, some small cowardly joke to smooth it over, the way she always did. But before she could speak, a voice cut cleanly across the table from behind her, warm and unhurried and utterly certain. Judge Doyle, I thought that was you. Vivienne turned. Standing at the edge of their table, resplendent in a black tuxedo, was Harold Whitlock himself, the firm's founding partner, 81 years old. A man so senior he rarely attended his own firm's events past the first hour. A man whose approval could not be bought, flattered, or faked. He was not looking at Vivienne, he was looking at Marcus, and his weathered face had broken into something close to reverence. It's been years, Harold said, extending a hand that Marcus rose to take. I heard you'd stepped back from the appellate bench, but I had no idea you'd resurfaced on the federal side. My God, man. Doyle, I clerked for your mentor, you know. Judge Aldridge used to talk about you like you'd invented the law yourself. The table had gone from quiet to silent, a silence with a texture to it, thick and disbelieving. Judge, Gretchen said faintly, the word barely making it out of her. Harold turned to her, and then to the table, with the mild confusion of a man who had assumed everyone already understood the obvious. You don't know who this is. Marcus Doyle, youngest judge ever confirmed to the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, before he stepped down to take a federal district appointment 3 years ago. Closer to home, he told me. More trial work, less politics. His opinion on the Hargrove antitrust case is taught in half the law schools in this country. He clapped Marcus warmly on the shoulder. This man rewrote how we think about regulatory deference. And you're all sitting here talking about him doing paperwork. He let out a short, delighted laugh, entirely unaware of the wreckage it left behind. Bradford Ellis had gone the color of the white tablecloth. Gretchen's champagne flute hovered, forgotten, halfway to her lips. Preston Hale, 3 tables away, had turned at the mention of the name and was now walking briskly back toward them with the expression of a man recalculating an enormous mistake in real time. "Your Honor," Preston said, arriving breathless, extending a hand that shook almost imperceptibly. "I had no idea. Vivienne never mentioned we would have absolutely." "She didn't mention it," Marcus said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of gentle, devastating honesty. "Because I asked her not to. I like being introduced as her husband, not as a line on our sum." He glanced briefly at Vivienne, and something passed between them that no one else at the table could read. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and sadder than that. "It's the one place in my life I get to just be Marcus." No one at the table said anything for a long moment. Gretchen's mouth opened and closed. Bradford stared very intently at his silverware. It was Vivienne who finally broke the silence, and when she did, her voice was not steady, but it was true. "I'm sorry," she said, and she was looking at Marcus, not at the table, not at Harold Whitlock, not at the partnership committee that would decide her future in 3 months. "I've spent this whole night ashamed of the wrong thing." Harold Whitlock, still standing, still beaming, seemed to sense he'd stumbled into something more delicate than professional gossip, and cleared his throat. "Well, I'll leave you all to your dinner. Judge, always an honor." He shook Marcus's hand once more, nodded to the stricken table, and moved off into the crowd, already turning to tell someone else the news. The dinner did not end quickly enough. Gretchen found sudden urgent business at another table. Bradford spent the rest of the evening finding reasons to compliment Marcus's insight on things Marcus hadn't actually said. Preston hovered nearby, with the anxious attentiveness of a man who suspected he had just watched his own career calculus shift, but Vivienne barely noticed any of it. She sat beside her husband, this quiet, steady, extraordinary man she had spent 3 years quietly minimizing, and felt something in her chest crack open. Not shame anymore, but grief, for all the rooms she had walked into ashamed of him, all the times she had softened his job into something forgettable because she was afraid of what people would think, when the truth was, he had never once needed her to make him impressive. He had simply needed her to be proud of him exactly as he was. Later, on the drive home, the city lights sliding past the windows, she reached across the console and took his hand. "Why didn't you ever tell them?" she asked. "Any of them?" All this time, Marcus was quiet for a moment, his thumb moving gently over her knuckles. "Because you never asked me to prove anything," he said. "You just needed me to be enough. And I didn't want that to change just because a room full of strangers finally agreed." Vivienne felt tears she hadn't expected rising in her throat. "I wasn't enough tonight. I let them talk about you like that. I let it go on." "You stopped it," Marcus said. "Eventually. That's what matters. Eventually isn't good enough. It's what most people manage," he said gently, "on their best day." She laughed, wet and unsteady, and pressed his hand to her lips. 3 months later, when the partnership committee delivered its decision, Vivienne stood in the same ballroom, in a different gown, and gave a short acceptance speech that mentioned, for the first time in 3 years of galas and dinners and quiet cowardice, her husband by name, not as a line, not as a credential, but as the reason she had learned, finally, what it actually meant to be proud of someone. Marcus stood at the back of the room, near the doors, the same quiet man he had always been, and when their eyes met across the crowd, he didn't need her to say anything more than that. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the world to notice what they're worth. Marcus Doyle had never needed the world's permission. He only needed, in the end, for the person he loved most to finally see it too. And on one golden, chandelier-lit night in a Chicago ballroom, she finally did.